Hello, everybody, and welcome to the 13th episode of Facts on the Ground. My name is Jesse Zerwell, and I'm here with my co-host, Misty Winston, and we are very pleased to have two guests today to speak to us about the latest state of affairs with the Julian Assange extradition case, and maybe a few more topics that might crop up. We have Taylor Hudak, who's with us. She is a journalist and editor with Activism Munich, who's been providing frequent updates on Julian Assange's extradition case, getting down into the nitty-gritty details. And we also have with us Mohamed Elmaazi, who joins us from the UK, from London. And he is an editor at the Interregnum. He's written for the Canary UK, the Canary Global, Grey Zone, Sputnik. He has a new piece out with Sputnik, a new interview, I should say, The Real News, and other outlets. And he has been covering the Assange case in the nitty-gritty details as well. So thank you, Taylor and Mohamed, for joining us today.
Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, thank you.
So before we get started, I just want to say thank you to both of you. In a world full of, journalists who refuse to cover the Julian Assange case, you guys have both been doing incredible work covering the extradition hearings and all the chaos that goes along with that. So thank you both for that. I did want to start with Taylor. We actually met at a Jimmy Dore show about a little over a year ago. And before then I had been following you on Twitter. I had started following the Action for Assange Twitter. I was very excited about that once Unity for J kind of dissipated. And so can you just kind of give our viewers sort of a background as to how you came into the Julian Assange case and what made you so passionate about first starting Action for Assange and now covering it as a journalist?
Yeah, so I just started covering this case about a year ago, and I was tweeting about it frequently, and I was actually in grad school at the time, and I wanted to do my thesis on WikiLeaks representations in the media. That idea was shot down, and I thought that was really, really interesting and quite bizarre, considering I knew that this was going to be perhaps the biggest press freedom case of our time. And so I started to look into this more, and I saw how serious it was, and it just kind of, that's how it started. And the more I looked into it, the more I realized that this is something that needs to be talked about, and I realized that this was an extremely serious situation. And I was quite perplexed as to the fact that, even just like 2 years ago, I felt that I was not nearly as knowledgeable as I should have been as somebody who was studying journalism. But I was tweeting about this. I was posting updates on Twitter, and Andrew Smith and I were both called on to do a podcast, and that's how he and I met each other. And by the way he was speaking, I could tell that he was from Ohio as well. And this podcast, just to note, was about Assange's case. This was following his arrest. So this was about a year ago. And so I reached out to him. I said, why don't we do something? Unity 4J, quit doing the vigils. And he wanted to pick that up. I was a little bit hesitant to do so, but we ended up doing that. And we also did on the ground actions, posting signs in our communities, trying to educate people about this case. And it just kind of took off from there. And then we were joined by Steve Poikinen. I'm no longer as active with Action for Assange at this time because I'm working for Activism Munich, and that's where my focus has been. I've been providing updates, as Jesse said. So that is where that is at. But Misty, I know you've been covering the case with Action for Assange for a little while now. So that's how I got into this. And then as this case continued, we realized that we could really do vigils every single week because there was something new to cover.
Excellent. Mohamed, how did you come to focus, or not focus, but have as one of your focuses what's happening to Julian Assange? Were you following WikiLeaks and Assange from their emergence, or were they something you came to later as a journalist?
No, I recall I mean, in particular, the collateral murder video when that came out. So I've always been, shall we say, interested in politics. I mean, although it even feels strange to say that because where I grew up, everybody was like you didn't distinguish from politics and anything else. So that didn't happen till I came to the United Kingdom, and I'd be with groups of people like, "Oh, let's not talk about politics," and that literally meant basically anything that wasn't drinking, films, and sports, basically. Because it could be about the environment, it could be about anything that somehow is related to politics, right? Because politics is just about power relations between people, right? That's, if you like, the shortest possible definition of politics. And it was just really significant when I heard that all these documents were being released. And I recall a documentary on Channel 4, which is one of the quasi-public channels here. It has adverts, but it's also partially publicly funded. And that documentary, they used WikiLeaks documents and all the sort of after action reports, these military reports. So after an incident will happen, somebody will write an after action report. I think that's what they called them. And they'd say, we engaged the enemy and this many people dead and this is what happened. And they looked at loads of incidents. So first of all, there were more civilian casualties than were being publicly announced because these are private reports, right? But then even when they went to Iraq and they tried to find the people involved in various incidents that were covered, they also found higher civilian death tolls, allegations by the people who were there that people like opened fire without warning. And I recalled that, and I recalled how significant that was, that cases were just, the number of things that were constantly coming out as a result of revelations. I remember, I think there was a government that had to step down in Kenya, if I recall correctly, after documents had revealed corruption. So it was spanning the globe in terms of things that were being revealed. And then again, documents that came out that preluded what we refer to as the Arab Spring, which showed, for example, that the US wouldn't mind if Ben Ali, who was the dictator that was backed by the French, was overthrown, and he was deeply despised, including by other members of the establishment. Him and his wife were. And when that had come out, that was something that was cited by many young people in Tunisia as something that sort of gave them hope, right? So when the imperial hegemon isn't going to come down against you, then that might be more incentive, for example, for you to take to the streets. It's one of the few countries that hasn't collapsed into complete chaos following that period, if you like, with other failed revolutions and coup attempts and things that are more complicated, say like Syria, where it's not straight up just people, revolutionaries. It's also largely sort of theocratic reactionaries who are trying to overthrow. So there's like an oppressive state, and then people who are, by my view at least, even more so, were they to get control of the state. But without wanting to meander, that was when I got my sort of understanding and interest in WikiLeaks. It was obvious to me that was very, very significant. And then once I got into journalism, I transitioned from law almost by accident, really, just because of the state of affairs in law. Then whenever it was possible to do a story on that, I'd either pitch it when I was working at the Real News, where I wasn't working as a journalist per se. I was working as a researcher, and I was pitching stories and securing interviews. And then eventually with the Canary, when I ended up leaving the Real News and I ended up writing more articles, I ended up focusing as much as I could whenever there was any kind of update, any excuse to keep it in the public consciousness, I took.
And that's something I kind of wanted to talk to both of you about. Just, you both are in the field of journalism. And I've talked about it on this show. I've talked about it on Action for Assange before. The hesitancy of people in journalism to cover this case is baffling to me. I understand why mainstream media doesn't cover it. Their corporate overlords don't want them to, and that's all well and good. But even in independent journalism and independent media, the YouTube left, even those people won't cover it. Why do you guys think that is? What do you think about Julian's case turns off even those amongst us who are supposed to be on the progressive left, who care about free speech and free press?
I would have to assume that's probably because it is not a topic that will generate a lot of money. It could perhaps get a lot of views if there is a major update. So, for example, the arrest back in 2019. Also, the news of this latest superseding indictment that we learned of through the DOJ's website. And things like that, I believe people are more willing to cover the case. But I think that oftentimes if you have Assange or WikiLeaks in the title on YouTube, it's going to get demonetized, or sometimes I think journalists may put this behind a paywall. I can't really say for certain why people aren't covering this perhaps as much as they should. I think it's maybe even more complex than that. I feel that if people's basic needs aren't being met, which in the United States, I mean, we're in a real crisis here. People can't pay their rent. People can't put food on the table. When your basic needs aren't met, it is very difficult to then think about the more abstract ideas being freedom of speech and freedom of the press unless you are actively engaged in this topic and in this political world. So I think that also could be a reason why maybe it's not covered as extensively, because people are more focused on these other issues domestically. But again, at the same time, of course, that is no excuse not to cover it. It's a really important subject, and whatever your passion is, that could be animal rights, gay rights, whatever it is, you need to have a free press and the First Amendment in order to advocate for whatever cause you're passionate about.
Mohamed, what would you say to those people who say over and over again that Julian Assange is not a journalist, WikiLeaks is not a journalistic outlet, it's a information dump at best? What would you say to those critics?
Well, I mean, a point that the journalist and former constitutional lawyer Glenn Greenwald points out repeatedly is that in the United States, there is no official designation as to who is and is not a journalist. It comes down to whether or not you're engaging in journalistic activity. So you don't have to, it's not like a guild where you must be accepted by other members of the guild before you're officially recognized to have protection. So any individual, even if they're non-professional, could potentially be engaging in journalistic activity, and that which is protected by the First Amendment. So I point that out first of all. Beyond that, I would say that that kind of thing that comes out tends to come out from those who oppose the types of material that WikiLeaks is releasing. So in order to detract and distract from the revelations, and it's important to note that until today, WikiLeaks has not published a single document that has been proven to be false. And, that might not last forever because, that's an incredibly difficult track record to maintain. They've never once been compelled to make a retraction. So in terms of professionalism and quality, that's quite significant. But if you want to distract people from the message itself, then you start talking about the person's personal life and their personality and all the kinds of things that they don't engage in when it's like Rachel Maddow. Like, I know practically nothing about Rachel Maddow or how she is with her staff or whether she's had multiple relationships broken apart or, whether she got drunk at a party. I don't know any of these things about her or about any of the people at Fox News other than like Bill O'Reilly, obviously, when that came out and quite rightly came out that he's sexually harassing staff and beyond that. But unless things come out as news in terms of, that's practically the criminal behavior there, at the very least civil violations in some case, that's sort of not relevant. What's relevant is the quality of the material that they're producing. When you start hearing more and more about somebody's character, and this is something I noticed years ago that was directed towards Robert Fisk, who is a very long time investigative journalist who publishes with The Independent. He's been living in Beirut for over 2 decades. And there was a phase, I heard people say to me once, I heard that he's actually a bit of a dick. And I was like, yeah, I don't care. He's not moving into my flat. right? We're not going to be housemates. It's, I don't need to like you as an individual to appreciate. I'm not saying I dislike him. I don't know him personally, but I don't need to like you as an individual to appreciate the quality of your work, and the only time I'm being asked to do that is when somebody is pushing back in terms of their reporting, in terms of their investigating, in a manner in which, shall we say, deviates from the acceptable norms within the establishment status quo at that particular time in that particular society, because it will be different in different countries, right? And that's when I hear it. So I would say WikiLeaks engages in journalistic activity. Julian Assange is a publisher. He's also an editor because he edits through the material, and he's also acted as a journalist by, obtaining sources, right? Interacting with sources in various parts of the world, dealing with that information safely, going through that information, and then publishing material. And it's not, first of all, they don't just publish material, although they do large scale do that, right? They have gone through a whole redaction process. This is a point that was made in the last substantive hearings, when they were accused of publishing wholesale documents without concern as to sources, U.S. sources. They were saying in court assets of the CIA and the U.S. military in Iran and elsewhere who could be exposed. Now, putting on a separate issue, I'm not quite sure why that would be his responsibility anyway. I mean, if you're an asset in Iran to the CIA, that means you're committing treason, but that's against your country. But the CIA are not necessarily the good guys. But I'm not saying that you should reveal it, but I'm also not saying it's not like there's a global law that thou must maintain confidentiality of the assets of the Central Intelligence Agency. Mm-hmm. He's not a U.S. citizen. He didn't swear an oath to the U.S. Constitution. He didn't sign an Official Secrets Act. And the organization is not based in the United States. But put that aside, WikiLeaks did, along with The Guardian and a number of other establishment papers, went through an extensive redaction process that was in consultation with the U.S. State Department at the time. And the WikiLeaks knew that the other papers were doing this with the U.S. State Department at the time. And so that means the State Department itself knew this, which means the U.S. government knows this. And the only reason that many of these documents ended up being published without the redactions that WikiLeaks had made, in fact, WikiLeaks did, and the redactions were there, was because there is these two Guardian journalists who'd written a book, and in that book, they had, for some reason that I cannot fathom, published the de-encryption key of the original files unredacted, which WikiLeaks had maintained in a host server or cloud somewhere, in order, just in case, right? In order that in case it became necessary. And it's a very long number. You'd never guess it. I mean, you take supercomputers to be able to break that kind of stuff, and even then, and a bunch of organizations, I can't remember which ones they were, like Pirate Bay or what have you. WikiLeaks found out that they had obtained that. Basically, someone had read through the book and seen the key. Mm-hmm. And Julian Assange phoned up. We know this because it was filmed for a documentary at the time called Risk by Laura Poitras, where she's filming him live as he and his then partner at the time were calling up the U.S. State Department to try to get in touch with Hillary Clinton to say, we've discovered that these documents in full that we've been redacting with you are going to be published completely unredacted. And then, and they got faffed about and like, oh, she's busy. Is this really an emergency, et cetera, et cetera. So that's important for people to understand, is that they did, and it's a learning process as well when you're starting up a news organization. And at the end of the day, they were filling a vacuum. They're filling a vacuum that existed because of the increased corporatization of press, increased consolidation, of press. And ultimately, there was, if you want to use a free market language, there was a gap in the market which needed to be served, and WikiLeaks got in there and served it.
And I think you brought up such an important point too when you said that, in the United States, you don't have to hold a membership card to be considered a journalist. But even more than that, like you said, Julian Assange is an Australian citizen. He also had Ecuadorian citizenship for a while. But WikiLeaks is not an American company. He's not an American citizen. And when Barr was asked, doesn't the First Amendment protect him? And he said, no, it doesn't apply to him. But it's weird to me that, our rights don't apply to him, but our rules do. And that really sets a dangerous precedent that this country can go after anybody they want, anywhere, anytime, if you dare embarrass them. And it seems like people aren't really recognizing the significance or the danger of that, which is really kind of troubling. And I know that's, all kind of been intentional, the smear campaign, the propaganda, all of that stuff. I mean, anybody who has even a tiny bit of information about Julian Assange, it's usually the wrong information. Most people are just clueless. Just what do you think about the implications, and this is for either of you, the implications of the United States potentially being able to, go after any journalist or really anybody, anywhere at any time? I mean, just as journalists yourself, that has to be a frightening prospect.
Taylor, you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. I definitely think if you are a journalist that is publishing this type of material that WikiLeaks publishes, that expose U.S. war crimes, that expose the national security state, you are really potentially in some trouble here. And you don't have to be in the United States to be held accountable under the U.S. Espionage Act of 1917. This is the first time this is being used against a publisher. So yes, it is extremely serious. Also, too, the fact that there's been an abusive process throughout these series of hearings. And to kind of go off of what Mo was saying earlier, it was during the first part of the extradition hearing back in February that the Crown prosecution had to admit in court that there was no evidence to suggest that anyone was harmed as a result of WikiLeaks publications. This is still something that we are hearing in the mainstream press. We're still hearing these smears because once you continuously talk about this, it really sticks with people. So there has been some serious violations in this case. Also, the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture has reported that Assange has been subjected to torture for several years while he was in the Ecuadorian embassy. He had 2 independent medical experts also examine Assange. The three of them met with him privately, and they all came to the same conclusion. So I think that's a really important point. And also, I think with this new indictment, I'm interested for your thoughts on this, Mo, as well. But with this new indictment, I do see this as an attempt to really secure the conspiracy to commit computer intrusion charge, because they really failed to show that there was a real violation there during the first part of the extradition hearing. So I think this, by broadening the scope of this already existing charge, I see this as really an attempt to secure this conviction with that specific charge, because it is almost an attempt to separate his activities from that of a journalist.
I would say you're exactly right, Taylor. I actually tried pointing that out, or I pointed that out to somebody else the other day, because they were saying they couldn't really see much of a difference between the new superseding indictment that we're hearing about. But on the first question, before I get to that, it is very concerning. I mean, it is an inherently imperial in nature process and law. What they're basically saying is that U.S. law that would normally only apply within the jurisdiction of the United States actually applies to individuals outside of the jurisdiction of the United States. And bear in mind that Chelsea, then Bradley Manning, when I'm just going to say she, just to make it simple. I'm not going to say he, then she. Okay. So Chelsea Manning, when she released information, when she was at the time a U.S. intelligence officer, right, if I recall correctly, and released information to WikiLeaks, I mean, she was based in Iraq, was she not? Right. So you have WikiLeaks based. I don't actually know. I mean, I can't remember where physically Assange was at the time, but he wasn't in the United States. Chelsea Manning wasn't in the United States, but somehow part of this conspiracy charge to publish classified documents, which I've asked multiple U.S. lawyers, constitutional lawyers about, and they said for the most part, they said if there is a conspiracy that you can show that they compelled her to go above and beyond, there might be something there in terms of stealing information. If they facilitated in a particular way, you'd have to show a certain degree of facilitation. But the rest of it, they said, that looked like just background noise. Just you just throw in as much as you can to make it as easy as possible for a judge to say, you know what, this needs to be sorted out at trial. But I would ask people to flip it around a bit if they're trying to get their heads around it. Think if the Chinese government decides that they don't like the fact that, I don't know, one of you, an American journalist, say, has published something that comes from secret documents that reveals waste, fraud, corruption, and criminality on the part of the Chinese state, and you published it, and you're based in the Philippines, and the Philippines has an extradition treaty with China. But you're not Chinese, and you're in a completely different country, and China says, oh, hey, you violated our Espionage Act, and so we want you extradited, even though you're not Chinese and you haven't signed any kind of Chinese law, and you're not based, you don't work for the intelligence services, you haven't signed their Official Secrets Act or whatever the equivalent would be, and you're not based in their jurisdiction. Do you think people should start being able to be picked up and then extradited there to be prosecuted? And that's the same idea. There's also proposals here in this country. The Law Commission, there's a largely reformist body called the Law Commission here, and it's existed for many years. And it typically gets asked to look at certain things, and sometimes they look at it even if they're not requested by government, if I recall correctly. And they might look at the murder laws here, right? So it's automatic life sentence in this country still to this day, right? And I think they've recommended on multiple occasions to reform that, right, and possibly do what the Americans do in many states, first and second degree, or on assisted suicide. There's no law granting protection if you assist somebody to commit suicide. That's murder, and generally that's not popular in this country. So the Law Commission has recommended. So it's largely a benign, if not reformist, institution. But in 2017, after being requested by, I can't recall which Tory prime minister, whether it's David Cameron or Theresa May, after being requested to look into the Official Secrets Act, which is very old here, it goes back many decades, about possibly reforming it, they came out with incredibly draconian proposals, including copying much of what you've got in the United States, but going even further. So right now, technically, there's no public interest defense for a whistleblower. There used to be when the Official Secrets Act was first passed, and then there was a successful case where someone raised a public interest defense, and then the government got rid of that defense, right? So it was there on paper until it was used, and they eliminated it now. So literally, you could publish documents that showed that the prime minister is eating the brains of children while they're still alive, and you have no legal defense. Right, I'm not saying they would necessarily prosecute that because it'd be too embarrassing, but you'd have no legal defense. Right, they could prosecute you for that. The Law Commission has proposed expanding prison sentences to 14 years imprisonment for a single charge, abolishing the need to show any harm. Technically, as a journalist, you can still be prosecuted under the law as it stands. They've recommended that it gets expanded to even those who publish second or third. So if you publish something a source gave you, you could be prosecuted today. If the proposals are adopted tomorrow, and I republish that which you've already published and is already in the public domain, I could be prosecuted and face 14 years in prison, right? This is now, so it got kind of stalled because of Brexit and all that noise. But now there's a parliamentary committee, an intelligence committee, which it's come out and they say, we're recommending that these recommendations get implemented. So it's really quite disturbing. So I want to add that to the context of what we're talking about. I do want to just put one minor correction. It's not the Crown Prosecution Service. It's the U.S. government. So the U.S. government is represented by a British barrister in court. But the Crown Prosecution Service technically is not involved in these extradition proceedings, right? As maybe behind the scenes they're advising, but they don't really need to because they've got UK lawyers representing them. So it is interesting. So it's actually the U.S. government. You'll be in court, and there'll be a lawyer representing the U.S. government. And when he says "we," he's talking about the Attorney General and the Justice Department, even though he's British, right? And then you have the defense team. So that's the sort of the setup there. I don't know if you want to mention the superseding indictment at all.
Yeah, thanks for that clarification there. Also, another note about the judge in this case. This case has been overseen by Judge Vanessa Breitzer, who has some really interesting ties. And I believe it was the judge prior, Lady Arbuthnot, had real serious conflicts of interest in this case that she for some time failed to disclose. But as far as I understand, she is still
she's chief magistrate.
Current, yes. Yeah. Like she is still overseeing judges in her district, which includes Judge Baraitser. So that's another point. And Declassified UK has done quite a good job of exposing all of this. Just recently, they came out with a piece stating that this judge, Vanessa Baraitser, has had a 96% rate in previous cases of granting extradition. So the chances of his extradition are not only high because we know that the United States is involved here, but also because of her history as well. Now, I don't know how common it is for the UK to grant extradition in cases in general. That number could be quite high. I don't know if 96% is the norm, but there's a lot of disinformation out there too that if he is extradited to the United States, somehow everything is going to work itself out and that this will be a fair trial. Unfortunately, that is not at all the case. So it's important to ensure that this extradition isn't granted.
Yeah, it'll be like A Few Good Men, you know, with Tom Cruise, and you'll be shouting, and then eventually the senior commander on the stand will shout and give out his guilt and say, "Of course we know he's not guilty of anything, and you should release him," right? Because that's how court works in practice. You know, that's my experience at least. It's very gratifying, actually. Unfortunately, that's not the case. I remember being so disappointed when I went to observe some of my first court cases. I was like, oh, this isn't Law and Order at all. I wanted to be a lawyer since I was, in my teens. I knew I was going to law school. I was like, oh, that's good. But eventually you get over it when when you're actually representing people. It's and working on cases, but that's a separate issue. But so Lady Arbuthnot, right? Her husband is a long-time member on the Intelligence Committee in Parliament as an MP. That's right? As a member of Parliament. And her son sits on the board of a company which owns another company, which came out after WikiLeaks to basically say we can deal with your, this kind of problem of WikiLeaks, cybersecurity type stuff, like specifically in relation to WikiLeaks, and he still does. The husband's been involved in links to all kinds to MI5 and MI6, and these are the kinds of things that they discuss in the article. They took paid trips to Turkey at a time when the Turkish government was still reeling from revelations that have been published in WikiLeaks about all kinds of corruption scandals and money laundering and all manner of other things where WikiLeaks, I think, had been blocked for a while online. So there were all kinds of things, and then she just sort of vanished into the background, and then this other judge, Judge Vanessa Baraitser, has taken on the case, who I have to say, doesn't seem particularly interested. Well, I'll give you an example. So there have been multiple times where the lawyers have come to the judge and say, look, we're not getting proper access to our client. And this is already Belmarsh Prison, which is a maximum security prison. The prison's being quite unhelpful. They're not giving him, it took months for him to get his glasses. They weren't providing him with a laptop. Or they weren't permitting a laptop to get there for many months, and when they did, they said it's not usable. It doesn't. There's thousands of pages involved in this case, and he can't review the files in his own case. And she's like, "Look, I don't have any jurisdiction over the conditions over which he's held." I actually put that as a quote in a headline in one of my articles at Sputnik. And then the next time round, one of his lawyers raises here's another case, a completely separate case with a different judge where the prisoner is also in Belmarsh Prison. It's ongoing right now. And they've also been having difficulties, right? And the judge got on the phone, called the prison governor and said, sort this out. And it got sorted out. Mm-hmm. And even, so it's like, look, here's precedent, if you like, is a high court judge in that case, of a judge intervening. And still, she's like, okay, I'm prepared to go as far as to say it would be helpful if the prison authorities would ensure that he has all the access he needs. I remember thinking, what kind of message does that send to the prison or the prison governor? With one judge is calling up and saying, "Sort this out. You're violating the rights of somebody who's before me, and we need to have a proper proceedings, a fair trial." And another judge who makes a generalized statement out there and says, "Here, you can send that to the prison that I've made a generalized statement." So it's a bit of a farce. During the proceedings where I met Taylor when she came over to the UK, the substantive hearings, it was raised again that he'd been mistreated during one of the hearings. They said, "Look, yesterday he had been handcuffed 11 times, right? When outside of hearing time, when he was down in the tombs, if you like, the cells, he'd handcuffed 11 times, strip searched twice, and taken to 5 different prison cells, and his legal documents had been confiscated from him, his papers, his privileged communications with his lawyers," right? And they said that to the judge, and she was really quite irritated. She said, "Look, how many times do I have to tell you that I cannot intervene I have no jurisdiction over his conditions of prison?" And literally the prison is right next door to the court that was in. There's a tunnel that links the two. And I remember thinking, like, okay, I want to watch my language, but I remember thinking, like, who is this just, whack job, of a judge who's, where did you get your law degree? What kind of experiences do you have? You were never like a defense lawyer. Obviously, this is someone who wants to make it as an appeal judge or something, right? Who wants to make her way like up in the ranks, and you don't shake the tree, whatever. I'll make my decision, and then there'll be appeals that will go on for years anyway, and then somebody else can decide otherwise. I don't know. That's the feel I got. Who knows what the final decision will be? So I just want to put that into the mix. Oh, I did forget to mention, the extradition treaty with the United States is incredibly lopsided. So typically, the way it's worded, the United States doesn't need to even prove a prima facie case, right? All they need to essentially show is that it's the correct person that they're talking about. So some random person named John Smith doesn't just get picked up and sent over to the United States when it's a different John Smith. Mm-hmm. That's basically it, right? And there's a couple other things they have to show that, like, okay, what we're saying is a crime here is also a crime in Britain, right? So that people don't get extradited to a country to face prosecution for something which in this jurisdiction isn't a criminal offense. And then there's a couple other things. So it is an uphill struggle. It's important to understand. And that may explain part of a high extradition rate to the United States. I don't know. I haven't finished the article, so I don't know. And I absolutely recommend that people read the articles of Mark Curtis and Matt Kennard and others at the Maverick. Was it DC?
Declassified UK.
Declassified UK. It's actually linked to, I think, the Maverick, which is based in Australia. Or no, Australia or South Africa? South Africa, I think. But it's but they've got their own UK website, which is Declassified UK, and so that's another part of the picture. The UK doesn't have extradition treaties with like other countries where they're lopsided, where we have to prove more to get someone from the US than the US has to prove to get someone from here. And it's something that Jeremy Corbyn raised in court, raised in Parliament soon before he stepped down to Boris Johnson. And Boris Johnson sort of admitted in his response, yeah, you're right. It does, I think we do need to take a look at that. Because you know about the Harry Dunn case, right? Where there's a woman who apparently was driving on the wrong side of the road and hit a young man, 19, Harry Dunn, and killed him while he was cycling. And then she was very quickly flown to back to the United States. And the family is fighting for justice here. I published an interview I did with them recently outside of the Foreign Office. And it turns out her husband is CIA, and it turns out she's CIA. And it was alleged that she was just a diplomat's wife, but that he had diplomatic immunity that extended to her. But now it looks like that's all a farce. And that sort of narrative has fallen apart. And Mike Pompeo has said under no circumstances will she be sent back to face a prosecution for like manslaughter. Or dangerous driving, causing death by dangerous driving, which is like, okay, so that's interesting because that's a flat out case that we all like know has happened. She's not denying that it occurred. So it's that was a reflection also of the lopsided extradition treaty.
I'm wondering, Taylor and Mo, if you can both talk about the fact that the UK extradition law prevents the UK from extraditing political prisoners such as Julian Assange, and the fact that that stipulation has been essentially thrown out the window in Assange's case. He's not considered a political prisoner. He's not considered a journalist. Maybe he's a publisher. This playing with language to get around the laws of both the UK and international law. I'm wondering if you can talk about the sort of total disregard for the fact that he's a political prisoner and the attempts to deny the fact that he's a political prisoner who can't be extradited under UK law to the US.
Well, I would say he certainly is a political prisoner. He is being held on remand right now, which means he's being held without charge. There were attempts to release him on bail. They were denied because he was considered to be a flight risk, which is a whole other issue. And that's really sort of a weak argument to make, because what they're doing is that they're citing the previous case where he breached bail in the past. But yeah, so he is being held right now on remand without charge. He already served his sentence for violating bail, which was a really extreme sentence. He received just 2 weeks short of the maximum penalty he could have received. He got 50 weeks. He served that time. He is still in prison right now. It does seem, in my opinion, that there are absolutely substantial reasons to release him on bail, considering his health conditions and then also COVID-19 in the prisons. But he is still in prison right now, and it is one of the worst in the UK, if not the worst prison, which is Belmarsh. As far as evidence of this being a political case, it was something that was addressed during the first half of the substantive extradition hearings, and they cited this attempt for Assange to reveal a source that was really orchestrated by President Trump in order to show that the DNC emails were not a hack, but they were provided from somebody who was internal to the DNC. And actually, on that note, just recently, yesterday, a judge signed off on an order in a case of Seth Rich's family. They filed a lawsuit against Fox News, and this was about a story that was published in May of 2017. It's no longer on their website, I don't think, but it was about the Seth Rich case, suggesting that the official narrative isn't true and that perhaps he was the individual who leaked this material to WikiLeaks. So his family is suing Fox News. The judge just signed off on an order yesterday allowing for Assange to testify in this case. There's a series of questions for him to answer, many of them having to do with how he obtained these documents, who it came from. I don't think he's going to answer any of these questions because he was given that opportunity previously and failed to do so. So here is more evidence of this being a political case. This latest indictment shows that this is, in fact, a political case, because some legal experts are saying, one of them is his fiancée, Stella Morris, recently tweeted out that this latest indictment is 15 months late, and it could be viewed as an attempt to further delay the second half of the extradition hearings until after the U.S. election, which is to take place in November. And it's unclear right now if that's going to happen. And a formality in the case would be that they would basically disregard this current extradition request and rearrest him under a new request in order to delay this whole process. That is just speculation at this point. But for some background information on this latest indictment, none of the information provided in the indictment is new information. It was made public some time ago by an individual named Emma Best, who has an interesting history with WikiLeaks as well. And this information was made public by her, but it is also based off of the testimony of 2 government informants. One of them is a convicted child predator. So it's really disturbing to know that the U.S. was willing to work very, very closely with Sigi, who is the convicted child predator, was formerly worked with WikiLeaks as a volunteer. So there's a lot of evidence in this case that it's certainly political. And under the UK Extradition Treaty or Act, it's one of them. You cannot extradite someone based on political purpose or based on political offense.
Yeah, that's right. It's there's 2 aspects to it. So the U.S. government is essentially arguing that there was wording about political offenses, but that it got dropped, right? So in a revised version, in the act and legislation, but it does exist in the treaty. So there's 2 things. There's a treaty, and then there's legislation, like the actual UK legislation. And they're saying, so look, it's not there anymore in the legislation. And the other side is arguing, okay, but it's silent. If they wanted to, they could have said that political exception no longer exists, and they didn't. And then they also argue, look, this is part of an international norm that people shouldn't be extradited for political offenses. And they go to the EU and showed examples in the EU and showed examples like pro forma sort of documents, rights-based documents from the United Nations, etc. So both sides are arguing what almost feels like you're dancing on the pin of a needle, right? So that's how many angels can you get on a pin of a needle, and to see whether or not the judge is going to make a ruling that yes, it's still the law in terms of political offenses, or it's not. There's also the fact that actually you have to read legislation in this country in a manner in which makes it compatible with the Human Rights Act, right, of 1998, which is sort of like our Bill of Rights, if you like. That's actually enshrined. The first time you had a document that was enshrined with very clear in terms of UK legislation, other than the Magna Carta, I suppose, but that goes back a long way. And they're saying, therefore, unless parliamentary legislation explicitly contradicts the Human Rights Act, you have to interpret the law in conjunction with that, which says you have the right to a fair trial, you have the right to due process, and they're kind of trying to get it through that angle to say that because of the Human Rights Act and because of case law there, you have to interpret it in a way which means that you cannot extradite for a political offense. They're also arguing that there's clear evidence of violation of due process by the US, and including the fact that, and this is going to come out more in the second part of the hearings, the fact that Julian Assange was apparently spied upon by the very security apparatus that was originally hired by the Ecuadorians to protect the embassy, and that he was doing it on behalf of the Central Intelligence Agency via Sheldon Adelson, as is documented quite well by Max Blumenthal in his Grey Zone piece, which I recommend people look into, and I interviewed him about that as well, about his piece. For Sputnik, it was published in Sputnik. So yes, it's true. He's kept in pre-trial detention, which they don't really have to. Yes, I understand he was convicted for absconding while on bail, but as the lawyer pointed out, he didn't just run anywhere. He went to an embassy where he was granted asylum, which is your right under international law. So it's not just like he fled. And the other side is saying, okay, but the reason he said he did that was because he was afraid that Sweden was going to extradite him to the United States, and that it had nothing to do with a case going on in Sweden, but it, in fact, was everything to do with the United States. So really, since we're trying to extradite him to the United States now, that's all the more reason for him to run. And the other side argues, look, we have people on terrorism offenses who are not kept in prison, who are kept in pretrial, with all the kinds of security measures and GPS tracking and etc. And it's like, we have a house where he can stay. And they also pointed out, unlike last time, now he has not a wife, but now he has a partner and 2 children, right? Whereas that wasn't the case last time. So essentially, he has family, he has roots.
He's so well known that we're in the middle of a global pandemic. most places are under some form of lockdown or another. Where is he going to go exactly? I don't know where they think he's going to run off to. It seems a little ridiculous.
She said she was unconvinced. The judge. She said she was unconvinced. She said, actually, she went beyond that. She says, there is nothing that could convince me otherwise, effectively. So I was like, really? Okay.
And I also think as far as like the political prisoner thing goes, if I remember right, it was beginning of the year sometime, the Queen was asked to intervene on his behalf. And didn't she refuse to do so because she says she has to remain non-political?
Yeah, she's officially speaking.
Yes.
I mean, she's done it before. She intervened to essentially engineer a coup in Australia when there was a prime minister there that was not favored, and people can look into that as a fascinating history of how, like, essentially, you had somebody who was considered to be too left who was basically overthrown. But that you could say, oh, that was decades ago or what have you. But yeah, generally speaking, yeah, the Queen is not meant to be overtly intervene in political affairs. Although, their members of the royal family do participate in assisting with trade deals and selling, it includes arms, like weapons deals and stuff. I think Prince Andrew used to, if I recall correctly. That would be the same Prince Andrew who is no longer engaged in royal duties due to the current allegations of sexual impropriety linked to Jeffrey Epstein. The endless list of victims.
Mm-hmm.
He's an interesting character. I am glad you brought up UC Global though, because at the last hearing, Assange.
Hey, Misty.
Yeah.
Your mic's dropping out a little bit. I just want to let you know. The volume is, at least for me. I don't know if anybody else is experiencing that.
I didn't do anything to it. I promise. Okay, Jesse, why don't you go ahead and I'll mess with it.
Okay. So Misty brought up UC Global, which I mentioned earlier when you were talking about Assange being spied on, Mo. And I'm wondering if you can both talk more about this firm, this CIA steered firm or hired firm, and how some of its employees actually turned on it and its operation once they realized what it was doing, what they were participating in. Basically, who is UC Global and what did they do when they were supposedly guarding Assange in the embassy?
Yeah, I'll start with a little background information here. So UC Global is Undercover Global. It is a private Spanish security firm that was hired by those in charge of the embassy in Ecuador to basically protect the embassy. Originally, it was not to spy on Assange and spy on his visitors. That's eventually what happened, but it was to protect the embassy, not only Assange, but also the staff members who were there. Well, this security firm is owned by David Morales, and he actually went to the United States. He was at an event which was related to Sheldon Adelson's Las Vegas Sands Corporation. I believe it was the company's actual event. And there he was mingling and speaking with people in the United States. And for some time, the Las Vegas Sands Corporation was acting on behalf of the CIA in China, I believe. But the corporation then used this opportunity to kind of work out a deal with David Morales in which they employed him to basically spy on Assange. And they took the security system and they basically created a separate feed for the CIA. And instead of the security system being used to protect the embassy, it was then turned into a system in which Assange was spied on, not only through video, but also audio as well, which raises a number of problems and violations in this case, of course. So While he was in the embassy, Assange obviously was meeting with his attorneys. So those privileged communications were spied on by the very same people who are actively participating in his prosecution and political persecution. And it was the gray zone that, well, it was El País who originally broke this story about a year ago now. It was fall of 2019. And then Max Blumenthal, through the gray zone, started to do some more digging where we really got into some of the greater details about what was happening. And in one of the articles on the gray zone, there is actually not a PDF, but like a PowerPoint presentation, all in perfect English, that was sent to those who were working for UC Global, instructing them on what to do there. So it was clearly showing that this was possibly coming from an American, at least somebody who was a native English speaker, because David Morales always spoke Spanish, and that was obviously his native language. So Max Blumenthal also made a point to say that he believes that, of course, UC Global is complicit in this spying operation, but that really the true people who are at fault here is the U.S. intelligence community, specifically the CIA, who orchestrated all of this. They were just using UC Global as basically a vessel to conduct this operation. But also his medical, all of his medical information has been viewed perhaps by the people that want to put him in prison for a long time. So that in itself should be sufficient to throw this case out of court. That is not the case at this time. And actually, there was a case, or there is a case going on right now in Spain, and Assange's fiance, Stella Morris, and also Balthazar Garzon, one of his attorneys, both were testifying just last week or 2 weeks ago in this Spanish security firm's case. So it is yet to be seen what's going to happen there, but I think the biggest problem is the fact that his communications were being spied on, of course, and then also journalists who were visiting him, their privacy was violated as well. And there's a ton of evidence to support this. So this is something that has been known for about a year now as well.
Yeah, even American Congress people, I believe, who visited Assange, or at least Dana Rohrabacher, who visited to offer him a pardon of sorts. Dana Rohrabacher was spied upon as well. So American officials were spied upon. It extended to everybody who was within his orbit. And I think it's really important to bring up UC Global and the extent of spying that's gone on with regard to Julian Assange, because a lot of people who aren't familiar with what's happening to him don't understand how he's being attacked from every angle and ground down from every angle to basically submit, to basically fall to his knees and give up and admit to what they're trying to charge him with, to what they're trying to convict him of. And I think because of that lack of knowledge of just exactly how much these state forces are putting on one man, a lot of people don't understand the gravity of his case, why it's so important for not just journalists, but for all of us who are concerned with transparent information and the truth, for lack of a better word.
Agreed. Is my microphone at all better, Jesse?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. I have no idea what I did to fix it, but there you go. Yeah, the whole spy, this has really been a decade-long quest by multiple different governments to slowly destroy one man. And as I have said oftentimes, this is, as much as it is about Julian Assange, it's not about Julian Assange. He is what I like to call the proverbial head on the stake. They're using him as an example. They want to scare anyone else who would dare to expose their misdeeds and war crimes, that this is what happens to you if you go that way. So, the UC Global thing it's horrifying. If they can do that to Julian, they're going to do it to anybody. The fact that they were able to record conversations between himself and his lawyers and, trying to steal his child's diaper to get DNA, that's horrifying. As a mother, that's next level disturbing. So yeah,
especially
I'm not
since
sure.
you can't get DNA from feces.
Right? I know.
So that's
which is another level of
stupidity.
idiocy.
Yeah.
Yes, agreed. But the fact that they can even go that far and that it's not a bigger issue, and again, I know that that's mostly due to lack of knowledge or, misinformation or whatever, but it's still really terrifying that, like I kind of mentioned at the beginning, that there are people who know what's going on. I harp on lefty media a lot because it's endlessly disappointing. Not that everybody is. I mean, the two of you do a great job. There are people like Max Blumenthal. There are people like Jimmy Dore who talks about Julian Assange. But for the most part, they're silent, and it's a very disturbing trend given that we know who they're coming for next. And it's not going to be Rachel Maddow or Wolf Blitzer. It's going to be the Kyle Kalinskis and the Tim Blacks and the Jamarl Thomases and all of those people who are on the left and exposing, well, some of them are trying to expose some of the corruption. So, I mean, the UC Global thing is really kind of terrifying. And I wish it were a bigger deal to people. Do we know, where that case is? I know that Stella just testified last week. I don't know how the Spanish court system works. Do we know about how long we think that will take? How that may affect the extradition case? Is there any kind of influence there?
I mean, obviously, the defense lawyers, I don't know in terms of timing. Maybe Taylor knows more than I do in terms of the latest developments in the Spanish case. Just for listeners, if they're not aware, David Morales, the CEO of UC Global, has been arrested and is being prosecuted for violating Assange's privacy and attorney-client privilege. And so he's actually being prosecuted for the kinds of things we've discussed. That we'd mentioned earlier and that Taylor had mentioned. And there's so many other things as well that gets covered, right, that we haven't had the opportunity to discuss, the kinds of things that they got up to, that there were discussions to assassinate Assange, to poison him, to kidnap him out of the embassy, to burglarize his lawyer's office, which then later got burglarized, later was burglarized. So, there's all kinds of things. One person was assaulted and their phone and things were stolen, and it's alleged by these whistleblowers that this was actually people connected to UC Global. So there are multiple things going on there. But in terms of the case, well, yes, of course, because actually the defense will be arguing, and these witnesses will be testifying in the second part of the substantive hearings that of the kinds of things that we've discussed and other aspects of the case. And really, that should show a poisoning of the ability for there to be a fair trial. I mean, I would get people to remember the Daniel Ellsberg case. Some people may misremember that Daniel Ellsberg, who was the whistleblower at the time, the largest cache of classified documents, until WikiLeaks, actually, until Bradley Manning, came from Daniel Ellsberg, the Pentagon Papers. There was a sort of a weird fawning film called The Post, which seemed to make it like the Washington Post was just out there speaking truth to power. With they did end up publishing documents, which is great, but they didn't, the same woman who was hailed didn't end up coming down on the Iran-Contra affair. She came out and said, we can't afford another Watergate. Right, so that's not, I'm not particularly impressed with somebody whose attitude is like that. And also, the Post was quite supportive of the war in Vietnam as well. Right, This is just towards the end. But anyway, Daniel Ellsberg was not found. It's not that the Federal Supreme Court found that Ellsberg couldn't be prosecuted. It's that the court that he was dealing with had found that the case had been so poisoned to the illegal activities by the state, including the FBI, including breaking into his psychologist, his therapist's office, I mean, all kinds of things, attempts to try to smear him, to say that he was linked to various communist groups and what have you. But like, breaking into, I can't remember if there's breaking into the lawyer's office as well. The judge says he won't be able to have a fair trial. The state has gone too far. And that was his victory. So I was like, okay, well, we're having this now in Assange's case. So the argument would be to this judge, and it will be to this judge, that you can't extradite him because they've already clearly poisoned the case. There's such violations of due process that he couldn't possibly get a fair trial, and it also shows the case is political, and so on and so forth. So I think that particular aspect of it, I think, is good for people to remember, that that's the reason why Daniel Ellsberg got off was because of the behavior that Julian Assange and those associated to him are being subjected to today.
So, Mo, you mentioned the Washington Post publishing parts of the Pentagon Papers that Daniel Ellsberg was able to obtain. And it reminds me a lot of the New York Times and other big papers who were more than happy to publish WikiLeaks's revelations, what they were putting out there, to use that information for their own stories. There were plenty of nonprofit organizations who were willing to host Julian Assange as a speaker. And now that he's basically in hell, these institutions are nowhere to be found to speak up for him. And it even goes beyond that, having false stories like the Luke Harding Guardian story, which he co-wrote,
which is still on their website, by the way, still to this day,
which hasn't been retracted. And I believe there's one up on The Intercept as well by James Risen that hasn't been retracted either. These are just totally unsourced documents of bullshit. And I'm wondering if both of you actually can speak to that, the mainstream media, especially their complicity in where Julian Assange is right now, why he's trapped in hell right now.
Well, that is correct. The New York Times, The Guardian, and Der Spiegel all published the same documents that WikiLeaks had published. One of the narratives that's been spread quite a bit was that it was Julian Assange and WikiLeaks who did not redact the names of people who were potentially at risk, when in fact that is completely untrue. I believe it was Mark Davis, who worked with Assange, said that it was in fact Assange and WikiLeaks staff who stayed up all night over the weekend to make sure that these names were not in these documents. And it's been completely twisted. Even legal professionals working for the U.S. government have continued to dispel this false information. And it's something that's really, really effective, unfortunately. And I do think it's part of a larger disinformation and smear campaign, because people are outraged and appalled that Assange would potentially put people's lives at risk, when that's clearly not what's happened here. It was Luke Harding and another individual who really put out information that could have been very harmful in the case. So technically speaking, and I'm not advocating for people at the New York Times or the Guardian or any of these publications to be imprisoned, but technically, if this is about fairness and justice, they also would be held accountable for publishing the same material. It seems that they're specifically after Assange. And another point that I wanted to bring up too about this very effective smear campaign and disinformation campaign, and it was something that Mo was bringing up earlier, is the fact that, it's true, we do not obsess over publishers or journalists' personal lives in the way that Assange's personal life and habits have been obsessed over by people in the media. And it's really strange to have this happen. So it's clear that this is, of course, probably something that was orchestrated by some very powerful people and has been quite effective. Unfortunately, even Niels Melzer, who is the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture, he too said that he fell for the propaganda and the disinformation that was in the mainstream media. when he was first presented with Assange's case and these accusations of torture, he at first didn't even want to really look into the case because he thought he was going to be manipulated by a quote unquote rapist who put people's lives at risk. He wanted nothing to do with this case. He said that all he had to do was just scratch the surface. He didn't even have to look that hard into the case before he realized that he had been told so many lies about Assange and WikiLeaks. And this is a professional person and someone who is obviously very educated. So he also went on to say that he was deceived. And if you think you're not being deceived, that means that the deception is clearly working, or it wouldn't really be deception. So that's another important point in this case. And we're not hearing about these personal lives of these other journalists. We're just hearing about Assange's life. And much of the things that are said about him to this day are not true, completely made up. And even former Ecuadorian consul Fidel Narvaez has been able to state that things that were said about him while he was in the embassy is all lies and disinformation.
Like throwing feces on the walls.
And not taking care of his cats, and yeah, all of that stuff. It really, if you look, I've done it a few times, but if you go back and just look over the past decade at all of the things that they've thrown at this one man, it's kind of amazing. It's been a real concerted effort by multiple different governments to destroy the character of this one man, to manufacture consent for exactly what's happening to him right now. They have dehumanized him in the media for 10 years to make it so that nobody will care when he's tortured to death, which is essentially what's happening. It's a slow motion execution at this point. So yeah, the smear campaign has been really effective. And actually, I'm glad that you brought up Nils Melzer, because he's somebody that actually gives me quite a bit of hope, because he bought into the bullshit, and when he was presented with new evidence that contradicted his previous thoughts, he changed his mind. And that's something I wish more people would be open to doing when they're, proven to be wrong. It's okay to be wrong, and it's okay to, change your views with new evidence. I think it's an important thing that people need to, allow themselves to do more often.
Yeah, and we need to allow it for other people as well. That's why I try my best, even if I want to, not to come down too hard on individuals, because you just end up burning bridges. And what ends up happening is that people's pride and fear kicks in. So that just means people will double down, right? And and I do see people that I won't name names, but people that I respect who will come down very hard. Unnecessarily, it becomes like, I see it on Twitter, right, where everything just becomes like a flamethrower thing, where basically it ends up being, it's like, okay, but then you won't have any people that you can convince of anything other than like 4 people that on this planet. So I think that's one thing that people should try to resist. Do your best to, whatever you may think of the individual, to try to focus, critique what it is they're saying and presenting. And then, if it turns out they have links to an organization, and that's really quite significant, then you point that out. But try to focus on the material. It's good to practice anyway, because quite frankly, that's what you're supposed to be doing, right? You're arguing for a particular point of view, so try to make it focused on that. And it's, I think in essence, we've come to now the answer of one of your first, if not your first question, which was, why is it you think that there hasn't been more people speaking out? And it's because of the success of smear campaigns and the success of just bad reporting. And I'm being in the media, I know how it is easy to just regurgitate that which you've already read elsewhere. It's not that all these people who are writing articles on Assange's case are themselves experts on the case and willfully publishing this material. It's that this becomes common wisdom pretty quickly. And I wrote an example to a friend who's in mainstream media, who was disputing my characterization of how Assange was covered in many mainstream outlets. And I just went and I said, 45 minutes later, I came back with a list of examples of references to rape charges when there have never been any rape charges. There was a preliminary rape investigation that's been repeated, and I saw it in BBC, and I saw it in in various outlets, and it just went time and time again. And I was just okay, give me 45 minutes, I'll come back and just give a whole list of things. I was like, this is just me from going from Google and just typing in certain words and pulling it out. And yeah, some things have improved a bit, actually, probably because of complaints from Assange supporters that do a good job of pointing things out when their things are just like grossly wrong, but there is just so many things that are, factual. The Daily Beast has just been absolutely atrocious. So I would recommend that people do not bother reading the Daily Beast at all, because whatever good there might be in the article will be well outweighed by just the atrociousness in the piece. The reality is people trust the outlets that they read, right? And if you do good journalism on A, B, and C subject, and you have some good reporters, like I think most, if not all, outlets will have, then if you don't know about a different subject and you read a piece that is more of a hit job than it is anything else, you're going to take it for granted. That's why it's disappointing when James Risen and The Intercept or a couple others publish stuff which sort of repeats sort of establishment talking points that have not been sustained. I mean, especially on Russiagate, but that's a separate issue. And I'm sure it's really frustrating for people in The Intercept, some of the original people who don't agree with the way things turned. But disappointing with James Risen as well, because it's almost like whatever good journalism he did stopped when he left the New York Times, which is sort of ironic given the love, and then he just came to just kind of pontificate at The Intercept in a way that it's almost like he was hired to do that. Not that I think people were sort of wrongly holding him up just a little bit, because the reality is he had information that the Bush administration was engaged in a mass illegal wireless surveillance program, and he was going to publish it with the New York Times, and the New York Times reached out to comment, and the Bush administration asked them to sit on it till after the election, the second election, because it could have, and quite rightly should have, cost them being re-elected. Not that he was elected the first time, but you know what I mean.
Right.
And the New York Times sat on it, and it's like, okay, but if you were Seymour Hersh, you probably would have left and published it with another outlet and risked getting prosecuted. You know what I mean? The New York Times only published it in the end when he was going to write it in his book, and they didn't want to get scooped by their own journalists. And that's something that always stuck with me, even when he was getting rightful credit for working on these sort of cases and divulging his sources. I always remembered that. I was like, okay, but at the same time, you're not in North Korea, right? So you could have published this. You just didn't want to risk losing your job at the New York Times. And quite frankly, I think that story, which was a massive story, could have and should have been, okay, I mean, I don't know, maybe he's got kids and they've got a mortgage and all the rest of it. But, that told me something, because I know people who would have, and there are people who did take those risks. Bill Binney, Drake, what's his name, first name? No,
Thomas Drake.
Thomas Drake, people who suffered for putting their country as they saw it ahead of their own well-being, and they suffered greatly. And as journalists, I think he could have and should have done that. So I wasn't 100% surprised, if that seems fair critique, but I don't know. You can feel free to cut out that ramble about James Risen. James Risen. I don't.
I have a bone to pick with him.
We both do, so it's okay.
He's gotten 3 whistleblowers put in prison so far. Reality Winner, John Kiriakou. Who's the other one?
What was his relationship to John Kiriakou? Are we sure about that? Is John Kiriakou said that he had a role in his prosecution? I'm not doubting you. I'm just questioning. I'm not aware.
I believe
honestly don't know.
that. Okay, so don't quote me on that. I'm going to look it up right now. But he's had multiple sources who've been whistleblowers and they've ended up in prison. Reality Winner being the main one. And if you...
I didn't realize that was Risen on that case, the one with
with Reality Winner.
Yeah, I didn't realize that was his story.
It was. And I don't know if you remember Aaron Mate's Real News interview with James Risen, where he looks at this, basically broadsheet, this intelligence broadsheet that Reality Winner handed over, thinking that it showed some sort of
Russiagate.
Right. That it verified Russiagate. And Risen and Matthew Cole, never mind that the document doesn't show anything but speculation, but Risen and Matthew Cole, who used to work at MSNBC, they brought it to, don't quote me, but I believe intelligence sources to verify the document. And so then these sources were able to obviously trace it back to Reality Winner, and she ended up where she is now. And it doesn't seem like he has any concern for the security of his sources. He, in every interview, talks about how his first concern is whether or not a story is a good story. And if it's a good story, he wants to tell it. And it almost seems like sources be damned. So I don't have a very high opinion of him at all. I think he's gone to seed.
So I did just look it up, and he was actually involved in the Jeffrey Sterling case.
Okay.
I also think that, not to put blame on anyone, but also Reality Winner talking to the FBI was not a wise decision either. Never talk to them or speak to them.
Well, not without your lawyer, you know.
I think that could have made things worse.
Yeah, and also there's, I don't know, I'd have to re-look into the case because it's been a while, but I do remember thinking at the time when it wasn't clear if the Intercept had screwed up in terms of helping the inadvertently aiding the state to discover their source. Part of me was wondering whether or not this was the kind of thing that was deliberately put before Reality Winner in the first place. Because if you're, sometimes we know for a fact the state will lie, and I can understand, I might even, if I was an investigator, will lie sometimes about how they know certain things, right? So they might, if you want to discredit as well, it helps if you want to like discredit people, like, oh, you can't trust the Intercept, so don't leak material to them. So part of it did seem whether or not this information was deliberately kind of being, because if you think that there are people who are inclined for some reason or another to leak information because of things they've said to people. I mean, she came off sort of did she come off to you as sort of like naive and young or what have you?
Yeah.
So then you might deliberately do that to like basically throw somebody under the bus in order to, you know, and there are such things as integrity checks as well to see whether or not somebody is on the up and up and whether or not they might actually be divulging classified information. So it's that had also come into my mind when some of these things had come out, because the core people from the Intercept know how to protect sources, and if anything, they got better because of everything that happened with Snowden, and they will have spoken to experts and, you know, and all the rest of it, and that was the whole point of the Intercept. And so I'm glad that it wasn't like Glenn Greenwald or any of the originators of the organization, at least. Right. So but that did, you know, that hurts when something like that happens. Yeah,
it hurts.
But okay, on the other side, none of us are perfect, right? That's why I won't that's why it's best to critique rather than to like flamethrow, I think. To critique, to see, like, almost scientifically do it. Right. Because you don't know when you might end up being the one, or when I might end up being the one who what I won't do is throw people under the bus. I know that doesn't happen.
Right. And that's not what I'm trying to do, and I don't have anything
sources stuff,
James Risen. I don't know him, but forensically looking at his body of work and how it's diminished over time, I think is worth doing, since he has such a large, and he should be taken to task when, like you said, he basically has this cushy job pontificating at the Intercept and putting out unsubstantiated rumors. So
they're not serious pieces.
It's especially important to critique people like James Risen and people in the media. Like people get on me for critiquing Amy Goodman because she's kind of taken a dive in the past few years. That's necessary. I love Amy Goodman. have like a serious lady crush on her. I wanted to be Amy Goodman. And so watching her over the past few years sort of regurgitate deep state talking points, and it's heartbreaking. And I'm not criticizing her because she's a horrible person. I'm criticizing her because it breaks my heart to watch her become what she's becoming. And I want her to do better. I mean, especially now, given, I think Mo brought up earlier, the kind of consolidation of power in media. We need people who will tell the truth, and we need people like the Amy Goodmans of old, people who will stand up to power and who will speak out. And so when those people start slipping, we need to hold them accountable. It's necessary.
Yeah, that's painful. I used to watch Democracy Now! Every single day, literally for years. And I have to say it's more since Russiagate, since Trump's election, that started to wane, where it became too painful. It was almost like I'd rather not watch it than watch it and be disappointed. You know what I mean? So that's mean like not wanting to deal with reality. It's like I've got other kinds of things I've got to deal with anyway. So I'd rather just remember, maybe we'll get to the next president and I'll come back and start watching you again. And I know they're trying. I know that it's not that they're not trying, but there's and obviously we're allowed to have different perspectives. It's not that you have to only represent my belief system in order for me to listen to you. No, that's not all the case. There are people who I genuinely really do respect, who I have serious disagreements in certain respects and on certain issues, but in some cases many issues. But when it does seem that it just I don't know what happened. They fell victim, but on Syria and on Russiagate, where there would normally be more critique. Okay, have the voices that you're having on, but also the other voices as well. Not as in one every 50, but one every 3, perhaps even. All right, the other side. And I understand the pressure is enormous, but still, it's like, but come on, you were there on 9/11, speaking out when that God knows what death threats and stuff they had to deal with. So it's not that they haven't had to deal with, having to push against the mold. That's when they started up, was, I think, President Clinton and then shifting into President Bush. And I remember, I didn't live in the United States, but I remember the environment at the time. I remember the Dixie Chicks getting canceled because they criticized Bush. Yeah. Right? They were canceled not by left, whatever, memes, young individuals at university. They were canceled by the right, by an entire class of people, across age groups.
Right. I remember that. And what they said was relatively benign, too.
Yeah.
It was
Bush is a war criminal. Okay, he is.
Yeah, just obvious fact that most people should have internalized by now.
Mm-hmm. Fox was very, very much in favor of that cancellation, as I recall.
What's that?
Fox was very much in favor of that cancellation, as I recall, and that really was canceling. I mean, they were losing. Their songs wouldn't be played on the radio, and bookings got canceled, and all the rest of it. So they lost an entire. It's there was a documentary called, what was it? Shut Up and Sing or something.
Something like that.
Yeah, which covers it.
Yeah, but going back to Democracy Now! Quickly and their coverage of Syria, because I think it's always important to talk about media coverage of Syria, especially so-called independent media coverage. They were among the first to, I think before it even came out, to embrace the white helmets wholeheartedly. And they interviewed the now late James Lemay, I believe that's how you pronounce his name.
Oh, they interviewed him. I knew they interviewed the director of the film, the Netflix documentary, if you want to call it that. But basically, propaganda film, which is okay to have a propaganda film if that's what if everyone knows what it is. Well, but it was sold as a documentary, as it were, not a for a British Foreign Office funded organization.
Right, and the Gray Zone was the first outlet, I believe, that I know of to expose the white helmets for what they are, which is basically the civil service wing of Islam State.
Not Islamic State necessarily, but other reactionary Islamist groups like Jabhat al-Nusra and more like Al-Qaeda side than Islam. Not to be too like parsing. Okay, technically it's a different group of Islamist reactionaries, right? So not those religious theocrats who want to overthrow the state, but the other religious theocrats.
HTS.
Yeah. What is now HTS? Yeah,
Right.
And yeah, and links with Turkey as well, because whenever areas got ethnically cleansed by Turkish-backed jihadists and fascists, white helmets who were excluded by the Kurds from operating in their areas, then come in and they start tweeting pictures. And I wrote a couple articles about that, and man, did I get slammed when, I mean, the head of the White Helmets, come out praising John McCain, and when John McCain had died, when they'd said that, I'd after he died, praising him as a man of peace. And I was like, I wrote an article saying White Helmets praise John McCain as man of peace. And I just like never ending just assault on Twitter. And it's like, dude, here are their comments. Here are their tweets. And here are some other people critiquing it and pointing out that where they get their funding from. And they're getting their funding from governments that are actively trying to overthrow the Syrian state. And they only operate, according to everyone I've ever spoken to down there, in areas that are controlled by Al-Qaeda. They don't operate in areas that are controlled by the government. They don't operate in areas that, not like the Red Cross, for example.
Right.
They don't operate. And the Kurds, who are left-wing socialists, do not allow them to operate in their areas. Well, what does that tell you? And then all of a sudden, when an area gets cleansed by them and replaced by reactionary theocrats, all of a sudden they're there with just like really good photographs, and just like everything is just so slick and taken. And they're all volunteers. It's like, really, then how are you living? And what's happening to all these tens of millions of pounds? Why should you have to volunteer in the middle of a war where your country is being liquidated? And your organization is getting tens of millions of pounds. Where are they going? Like, why should they? John Lemasurier not being asked that? Like, why are you not paying these people? And I'm sure many of them are well-meaning. You know what I mean? It's just
right.
Just like people who are being recruited by, like, hey, do you want to help kind of do some of the stuff? I'll give you a bit of money. Like, how difficult would it be able to find anybody who are you don't necessarily know what's going on, and there'll be loads of people who hate the government. So yeah, okay, you'll take the check and you'll appear in front of cameras, and you'll wave your helmet, and they always have these babies with the dust on their face. It's like just perfect. It's just all perfectly, a bit too perfectly done. It's like, really, I've been following Palestine for like years. So like, I'm half Palestinian. How come we never have photographs like that? And there's constant footage, and there's constant things happening, and drone strikes and airstrikes and what have you. And they're always like this. It's almost like a film, like hero-looking pose. I mean, whatever. Who knows? Yeah. Maybe some of it is real. I don't know.
And to that point, Dan Cohen, whom we interviewed on the show a few episodes back, he put out a very good short documentary. It's about 20 minutes long. I believe it's called The Syria Deception. So if you go on YouTube, and search Dan Cohen Syria Deception, you'll find it. And he does a brilliant job in those 20 minutes or so of deconstructing and unmasking the white helmets for what they really are, but also the larger propaganda campaign with regard to Syria, with regard to pushing regime change. And he confronts at least one filmmaker in it, and shows him footage of white helmets directly participating in Al-Qaeda
execution. Yeah.
Person is shot in the head, and they run in right away, wrap them up in a blanket, and carry them off. And this director is telling him that's bullshit. That's something that Sputnik put out. He says Sputnik.
Oh, I write for Sputnik.
Right. So to anybody who's watching, I recommend searching for that and watching it. It's well worth your time.
I wasn't aware of it. Yeah. The Dutch government, is it the Dutch government or the Austrian government? No, the Dutch. Yeah. The Dutch government did an internal review of like various groups of their funding, because all kinds of countries have been in on the Syria action, like Belgium, the Netherlands, Germany, France, Canada, the United States, Britain, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Turkey, the United Arab Emirates, Israel. So it's a lot. I mean, that's just on the side of regime change side, right? Which is, can you imagine all those countries, with excluding the United States, like investing in trying to overthrow the U.S. government? They may fail, but can you imagine the carnage that would be unleashed on the United States if like billions of dollars worth of weapons and rocket launchers and what have you were being given to every single angry person with a grudge, mostly KKK members and white nationalist people, to like overthrow the state, so that even if you're on the left and you don't like your government, you're like, do you want these people to take their place? So you know, like probably not, right?
No.
So, and I never ended up getting around to writing an article on it. And this internal document, basically, it looks at various groups that they fund. And they're like, of course, it's non-military support. They're very clear about that. Non-lethal support that they're providing to groups. And part of it is to the White Helmets via this company that's registered in wherever it was registered, Turkey or France or whatever, John Lemassour's company, which is the holding company. And they're like, this is what they say they're doing and how many people they say they're saving, what they're doing with the money, and X, Y, and Z. However, there's actually no process by which anything they tell us is independently verified in any way whatsoever. Recommendation, cancel funding. And that's what ends up happening.
Mm-hmm.
And strangely enough, and I think this might be because of the change of government there, this document is published in English. Yeah, this is the Netherlands, right? They speak English, but the official language is Dutch.
Right.
Yeah, and I remember when I came across that, I was like, that is very interesting. Why they've done that? It's almost like they're trying to preemptively justify their cancellation of. And you think that'd be like, more news? Okay, I failed to end up getting a piece out on it. But yeah. Anyway, if you're interested, I'll send that to you. I've completely forgotten about that. It's amazing how many stories I've got like half completed somewhere that like. I don't have a place to get them out, or I've lost the moment to publish them. I'll just publish them on my blog, I suppose.
Yeah, absolutely. We can exchange emails after we're done speaking here. So
we wrap up?
Yeah, definitely want to start wrapping up. Switching gears a little bit from Assange to the anniversary of the dropping of the first atomic bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki is coming up in a few days as well. You just conducted an interview at Sputnik with, who is it?
Peter Kuznick, a historian with American University, who co-authored The Untold History of the United States, which is a book and a series, a mini-series, a documentary series with Oliver Stone. And he also specializes, he set up the Nuclear Institute as well, so it deals with nuclear matters today. And one of the things that he's written extensively on has been specifically the decision to drop the bomb. And the headline of the article is, "Nuking of Japan was, quote unquote, totally unnecessary and didn't end World War II, U.S. historian explains." So that I tried to capture as much as possible in the headline. And basically it goes through to say, explain exactly why this has been known by anybody who's been focusing on this issue, not only for years, but for decades, since Garl Perowitz published his first book, Atomic Diplomacy, Hiroshima and Potsdam. Potsdam is the place in Germany where the conference was held with Stalin, Churchill, and Harry Truman after the end of the German part of the war. And basically explains, there were 7 out of 8 8-star generals at the time. 8-star. 7 out of 8 of the 5-star generals that existed at the time came out and explicitly said that either it was completely militarily unnecessary or it had no role even in ending the war. So basically what we've been told, including by Barack Obama recently when he went to Hiroshima, when he was still president, that the World War II came to its bitter conclusion in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, as Peter Kuznick points out. Professor Kuznick says that's completely nonsense. And this is something that was repeated during a recent history broadcast where I listened to a military historian, a British military historian, discuss his recent book on the Battle of Okinawa, Saul David. And he unfortunately ended up repeating the same thing during this discussion, that the Battle of Okinawa, which was incredibly bloody, the most bloody in the US for the US side in the Pacific, 12,500 deaths, many more casualties, non-fatal casualties, and that this informed Harry Truman's decision to say, like, hey, if we can save up to 1 million lives as well as Japanese lives, he says, this wasn't just about saving American and British lives from the future invasion, but Japanese lives. And I asked Peter Kuznick, I said, okay, what do you how do you respond to this point made by this professor? And he said, my response is, it's a crock of shit. And then he proceeded to explain. That's literally his quote. And he proceeded to explain why. And he said, he talks about all the cables that we know that the Japanese were sending to the Soviet Union, thinking the Soviet Union could help them negotiate surrender better. Wrongly, actually, because they didn't know the Soviet Union was planning on invading Japan, because the Americans were asking the Soviet Union to invade repeatedly, and the Soviet Union was busy, fighting Nazi Germany. Mm-hmm. And then finally they said, fine, we'll come in a few weeks. And then things turned after Roosevelt died, and Truman came in, and he wasn't interested in having good relations with the Soviet Union. And a couple of the people surrounding him were anti-Soviet hawks, and he wasn't even aware of the atomic bomb when he was vice president. It was literally, they're discussing like possible ground invasion, and one person's like, "Oh, by the way, there's this thing called the Manhattan Project." So they weren't even keeping him briefed on that. So they didn't trust him at the time, obviously, as vice president, and. Despite the fact that there was loads of opposition, there's opposition from the scientists connected to the Manhattan Project, and there was he even had, I didn't quote him in this, he wasn't quoted in this article, but I quote him in a previous article from 2 years ago. Curtis Lemay, who was the central figure, if you like, who oversaw the firebombing of Japan, in which hundreds of thousands of Japanese were killed, civilians were killed before the nuking. Right. And he was nicknamed Bombs Away Lemay by his people because of this, right? He came out and said explicitly that the nuking was totally unnecessary, it had no military application, and had nothing to do whatsoever with the Japanese choosing to surrender, right? So even he, you know what I mean, who was like the hawkish of the hawk, came out and said that. And you had General Douglas MacArthur, same thing, and Dwight Eisenhower, General Eisenhower, same thing, and others. And you have the fact that the president of the United States they were intercepting the telegrams from the Japanese. So the Japanese didn't realize that the telegrams by this point in time were being intercepted by the Yanks, and that they could read them and they could see that the Japanese, the primary thing was, there were two main things that could end the war: the Soviet invasion, because the Japanese did not, they feared a Soviet invasion. Mm-hmm. And the other one was, say that they could keep their emperor, because to them he was like a god, right? So he wasn't just like a king. He was our god. It was God. Like General MacArthur had a report commissioned before the invasion, right before the dropping of, there was no invasion, the dropping of the atomic bombs, which they told them. There was a quote that Peter Kuznick gave to me.
And you're talking Hirohito, correct?
Hirohito, who was who?
He was the emperor at the time.
The emperor. Okay, yeah, sorry, yeah. And the quote, go ahead.
They wanted to keep him as figurehead. That was like their main stipulation.
Yeah, and by the way, in the end, they did. Right. So I mean, they did end up, but they didn't. But they were demanding an unconditional surrender, and they were afraid that would result in the hanging of their emperor. Mm-hmm. And it just goes to show that it wasn't a problem in the end. Oh, and he was being begged, including by his own Secretary of War, right? Harry Truman was being begged, come on, let's just make it let's just put in this proviso that we guarantee won't execute your emperor. And the Secretary of State, so more of a Hillary Clinton type, think about that. So the Secretary of State was completely against it, and so was, in the end, Truman. And Truman relied on the Secretary of State. General Douglas MacArthur's Southwest Pacific Command commissioned a report in the summer, which said in the summer of 1945 that the execution of the emperor to them would be, quote, comparable to the crucifixion of Christ to us. All would fight to die like ants, end quote, right? So this is like what, these are the things that he's pointing out over and over again in the interview. They knew this. And in the end, when they did surrender, they said there were meetings, we know this, of the Supreme Japanese Military Command after the bomb was dropped, and they barely discussed it, the dropping of the bomb on Hiroshima, because as was pointed out earlier, more than 100 Japanese cities had already been firebombed. This Hiroshima was just another one. It was just another casualty of the war. What ended up causing them to agree to surrender was the Soviet invasion, as they destroyed the army in Manchuria, and they were plowing through. And we have records of them saying that as well, of the Japanese, including the prime minister. Was it prime minister at the time? Who said, no, we have to surrender now. And why? What's the rush? Why can't we wait possibly for better terms? Like, no, because we can't afford for the Soviets. Hold on, there's a quote here. Okay, here's a quote from a different military general, a chief of staff, who was Leahy, where he had said, oh, there were so many. Oh, no, here's one from the Japanese Supreme War Council issued a statement on May 16th that said, at the present moment, when Japan is waging a life or death struggle against the US and Britain, Soviet entry into the war will deal a death blow to the empire, right? There's another, the President, Admiral Leahy and Burns agree Japs are looking for peace, right? This is known as the telegram from the Jap emperor asking for peace. Those were Truman's words. Those aren't my words. Okay? I don't refer to Japanese as Japs. Right. But so and that was on a cable intercepted on the 18th of July, or intercepted on the 12th of July, referred to on the 18th of July by Harry Truman. So they're fully aware that the Japanese are looking for a means to surrender. It's just about the emperor. They fear a Soviet invasion, and basically the conclusion is, for various reasons, that the dropping of the bomb was about sending a signal to the Soviet Union, right? And they did send a signal, and the Soviet Union ended up building up a massive nuclear arms stockpile, and there is an argument that that is what essentially started the Cold War. And that's certainly what started the nuclear arms race. So far from sending a message that we're in charge, is send a message of that you need to stockpile loads of these, civilization-destroying missiles. And that's essentially the premise of the article, and people can check out the article or any of the other works of Peter Kuznick or Garl Perovitz.
Yeah, we'll link to that in the show notes, absolutely. And I think it's worth pointing out that a lot of people say that it was the second bomb on Nagasaki that was the unnecessary one that was dropped to give a major deterrent effect to the Soviet Union. I would say both were dropped for that reason. Would you agree?
Well, so my position on it is informed on the material that comes out. So when all the military commanders and all the senior commanders are coming out, and that's what they're saying, there was no military application. One came out, one who was actually good friends of Harry Truman at the time. So his chief of staff. So chief of staff who's Truman's personal chief of staff, who chaired the meetings of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. So this Admiral William Leahy later commented, the Japanese were already defeated and ready to surrender. The use of this barbarous weapon at Hiroshima and Nagasaki was of no material assistance in our war against Japan. In being the first to use it, we had adopted an ethical standard common to the barbarians of the Dark Ages. Right? He later told Truman's biographer, this is Admiral Leahy, Truman told me it was agreed they would use it only to hit military objectives. Of course, then they went ahead and killed as many women and children as they could, which was just what they wanted all the time. Right? So, I mean, these are powerful words. Can you imagine anybody who's like at this rank today saying things like this, or even 30 years ago? These are very powerful comments coming from his personal chief of staff, an admiral who also chaired meetings of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And this is the same. Douglas MacArthur, the same. So it's all the people, others are saying, I wasn't raised to kill women and children. I mean, obviously that's what they were doing with the firebombing as well, but obviously they thought that was militarily necessary. So it's basically the evidence shows that they all knew it had no military application. Bear in mind, they weren't nuking military installations. It's not like they nuked the Navy. They didn't drop a nuke on the Japanese Navy so everyone could see what, destroy a bunch of. They deliberately chose, civilian areas, right? They deliberately chose these populations. And the second bomb was a different bomb. It's made differently. One was plutonium and one was uranium, right? So you have the little boy was dropped. That's code name Little Boy. Dropped on sort of sick irony. Dropped on Hiroshima, and Fat Man was the one code name. The code name for the bomb dropped on Nagasaki. So it's also just testing a differently made nuclear weapon, atomic bomb. So yeah, it's not about, I agree with the deluge of evidence, right, which shows that the dropping of both bombs had nothing to do with the Japanese surrendering. It was the Soviet Union breaking through and entering the Pacific Theater, and the dropping of the bombs was about sending a message. Both of them was about sending a message to the Soviet Union, because originally the whole program was about deterring Germany. When scientists had told the Roosevelt that the Germans were trying to produce a nuclear bomb, and in the end they gave up for various reasons. So originally the focus was there, and then there was discussion. Oh, maybe we'll use it on Japan, but it didn't crystallize until Truman, and I didn't quote them because I'm not going to sit here and like bore people constantly. They can go and read up on the material, check out the article, and check out others on this material. But there's loads of quotes as well about Russia, about the Soviet Union. We're gonna show those Soviets something. You know what I mean? We're gonna tell those Ruskies, etc., etc. So it's not just the side of the bomb being unnecessary and the Japanese surrendering. Is all kinds of material to show that the thinking of the people who were in favor of dropping the bomb were all just thinking about the Soviet Union, because they're fully aware anyway of the Japanese willingness to surrender, if they can keep their God King from being executed.
Right. And what a grotesque irony that we're still dealing with the same boogeymen today. Russia now, right? Not Japan, but China. China has replaced Japan in a sense. And
except the fact that China is not an imperial, it not all of its behavior is good, but it's not doing what Japan was invading, enslaving thousands of women to be raped by their soldiers. You know what I mean? So, it's mostly economic what China does. China's expansion.
Right. I'm not saying it's an all for all comparison, but
no. But you're right that it's taking the place. I'm saying, notwithstanding the fact that it is not this aggressive military power as far as the West is concerned, in terms of there's no risk of China invading Europe or anything.
Right. So, yeah, it was good to go off on that tangent. I think it was necessary because it is, as we know, the anniversary of the dropping of the first bomb, and it still remains one of the worst war crimes and crimes against humanity in human history, I believe. And
because so many people in this country are completely uneducated about their actual history. So the more that these things get talked about, especially now that we find ourselves even closer to some other kind of nuclear war type situation every day, gets more and more likely. Talking about these issues, and those article is excellent. Everybody should check it out. It's definitely something that needs to us. People need to get educated about what's actually happening in their government, and that's what makes WikiLeaks so important, is that they provide us with knowledge, actual information. So it just really makes you even more.
Yeah, I was going to make that same connection too, to the dropping of the two bombs as the immense war crimes and crimes against humanity that they are, to what WikiLeaks' mission is, to expose these truths behind these crimes. So you can, I think, draw a straight line from the dropping of the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki to the collateral murder video. It's the same sort of imperialist, orientalist perspective that still regards these people, other people, whether they're Arab, whether they're Muslim, whether they're Arab Muslim, whether they're Asian, they're the other, and they if not deserve the crimes against them, they're worthy victims of the crimes against them. They're less than us, and I think that's why WikiLeaks is so dangerous to the state, to the establishment, because it puts that in everybody's face. Anybody can see it. Anybody can watch the collateral murder video, whether you support the war on Iraq or not, and you can watch that, and it's, I think, it neutralizes everything. It's horrifying, no matter which side you're coming from. And so, kudos to you, Mo, for writing this article. I think not many people have broached that subject now or in the past, and it's, the truth about that needs to be told. The official historical record needs to be told. And so, again, I think there's a direct line there that you can trace between that crime and the crimes that WikiLeaks has been exposing.
And really thank you to both of you for covering Ghislaine's case so consistently and so well. It's something that I wish more journalists would do. There are a handful of them in that group. But yeah, Taylor, I just want to let everybody know as we wrap up, where they find you.
Hey, Misty.
Yeah.
Your mic was echoing and going low in volume again.
I don't know if this point was touched on because I stepped out for a second, but as far as the coverage of what happened in Hiroshima, a journalist, Wilfred Burchett, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that name correctly, actually went to the site of the bombing after it had happened. He was one of the first Western journalists to do so, and his reporting was actually denied by the U.S. So we see this still happening today. So, of course, it's very important to touch on this. There's an article about this in Consortium News by Nozomi Hayesi, where she talks about this, and then she relates it back to collateral murder and how the video footage that you could see was actually denied, or there were many attempts to kind of cover this up. Of course, we learned through or it was highlighted in a report by The Guardian. It was actually a good piece that they put together where they spoke with Dean Yates, who was the bureau director of Reuters in Iraq at that time. And he spoke with the United States government, and Naomi Hayesi draws a parallel there. So that's another great article to check out in addition to Mo's wonderful work. But I think Misty asked for some closing thoughts. I just wanted to say, keep watching for what's going on with this case, familiarize yourself with it. Also, if you really want to get involved, there are things that you can do. You could find that on Twitter. I touch on it in my reporting as well. And you could find my work at Activism Munich. We're on YouTube. We also have a website as well. My work is in English and also in German, so you could check out my stuff there. And thank you guys so much for having me on.
Thank you for joining us.
Yeah.
And thank you too, Mo. Where can people find you online? Where can they find your work, and where can they find you on Twitter?
On Twitter, it's at M for Mohamed Elmaazi, ELMAAZI, which is just my last name. I write at The Canary, I write at Sputnik, and anyway, you can find most of the stuff there via my Twitter profile. And I have my blog, which I occasionally publish things on, is theinterregnum.net. And that's it, yeah.
Okay, great. So thank you both so much for joining us. I meant to mention it in the beginning, but I forgot, so I'll mention it now. Mo was actually the first person to follow me when I joined Twitter, so I don't know if he knows that he has that distinction, but thank you very much. So that's cool. It's cool to kind of come full circle in a way. Really good to talk. Really good to be face to face. And thank you both so much for joining us for this episode. I think it was a very fruitful discussion. and we went on some tangents, but I think they were all worthwhile. So thank you very much, everybody, for joining Misty and I for the 13th episode of Facts on the Ground. Our guests today have been Taylor Hudak and Mohamed Elmaazi, and you can find their work where they said you can find it just a few minutes ago. And we'll provide links in the show notes as well. So Taylor and Mo, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.